All right. Hey, welcome everybody to Telehealth Certification Institute's monthly interview series. We like to bring you guys the very best content and the most engaging speakers. And today we have a special treat. We have Dr. Samantha Fletcher, who is the Executive Director of NASW, New York State. And she is an expert in a multitude of fields, but she is highly specialized in the area of social justice. And her work in that area runs long and it runs deep. As a bunch of you guys know, we are going to be featuring different topics month to month. And so in the month of August, we're going to be dealing with racial justice, trauma, how that impacts your clients, kind of the current climate in our culture right now. And we are going to be actually featuring on August 7th a panel featuring Dr. Danielle Hairston from Howard University, dealing with that specifically and the intersection with law enforcement and your clients and what you might want to know. But Dr. Fletcher is actually going to kick us off today, speaking into the variety of crises that we're all facing now, personally and with our clients, from quick transitions into virtual telemedicine, COVID, social unrest. We're going to get through as much as we can and give her as much time as possible to talk. So I want to introduce you, Dr. Fletcher.
Hi, Cliff. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for being on. We are going to go through a couple of different questions today. So we're going to talk a little bit about NASW and as your perspective as an organizational leader, how you guys have worked through the transition into telemedicine, and then talk a little bit more about your research. So the first thing I wanted to know is, how did you guys at NASW first get involved with telemedicine and taking clients online and assisting with that?
So that's a good question. I first want to just say that I am not a clinician. So I personally haven't worked with telehealth, but I do represent tens of thousands of social workers in our state who are clinicians and who do use telehealth. So this first came on my radar in March. I started with NASW in September 2019, and then COVID hit in March. So 6 months into my tenure. And what happened very quickly is that not only our private practitioners, but also people who work with clients in different organizations had to transition from in-person therapy to telehealth. So that was my first introduction to it, and I knew nothing about it. So I had to learn extremely quickly, and I learned through our members by telling me, they were the ones who told me what was happening, what they needed, and how it worked and everything. So I would just say that we came in March, and the first thing we did as an organization is we offered a free webinar series for members and non-members. So any social worker or mental health provider could take this in the state of New York just to walk through what telehealth is, how you conduct it, and different insurance companies and how to navigate those insurance companies with telehealth.
Oh, awesome. What has been the biggest challenge you feel for your members with the transition coming on so quick?
So there's a couple of things. One thing at the beginning was regulations around how to engage in telehealth. So there were certain regulations like that they couldn't conduct telehealth through just the telephone, like it had to be an approved, like HIPAA approved service. We quickly were able, there was a policy passed, an executive order that allowed telephone only telehealth. So that was one of the first ones, is how do we actually engage in it? What platforms can we use? How do we keep privacy, with our clients and our records using telehealth, those sorts of things. I would say the challenge now lies within policies. So now, especially in New York State, right now we're at the very end of July. Our state's actually doing fairly well with COVID. We have flattened our curve. Our occurrence rate is fairly low, and we are in like the fourth phase of reopening our state. That being said, people are still very cautious, and they're extremely concerned going into September. So right now we have an executive order that through the Department of Financial Services that oversees the insurance companies for New York State, that's in place through September 7th. that states that insurance companies must allow telehealth services for social workers, mental health, addiction services, but that's set to expire September 7th. I will say that our governor's been very good about extending those executive orders to make sure that everyone is safe. But I do know that our members would really like to see a permanent policy in place that allows for telehealth, so that they're safe, engaging not only them, but their clients. And then the other biggest issue I'd say is pay parity. That I've heard from our members that some insurance companies may not be reimbursing at the same rate of services, which is an issue because they're providing a service. So they should be reimbursed for the service, whether that's in person or whether it is through telehealth. The service is the service. And if the reimbursement rate is taking into account overhead costs of like having an office, there's also overhead costs with telehealth, because our providers are having to buy telehealth capabilities. They have to up their internet. They have to have, the different platforms. So there's expense either way, whether it's telehealth or in person. So I would say policies. We need policy change so that they can continue to do their work safely.
So for people in the larger behavioral health field, or specifically even just in social work, what would be your number one recommendation to clinicians that are currently seeing clients and are just overwhelmed by the decision being so quick?
So what recommendation? That's a good question. First of all, I would recommend that they continue to advocate for what they need. So I am very lucky that our members and social workers in New York State, they tell me what they need. They make sure that we know the organization what they need in order to be successful at their jobs. So keep advocating, keep letting people know what you need to be able to do your job, because really that should be the least of their concern. Our providers, social workers, and other mental health providers, they carry people's pain for a living and they work to help people heal. The last thing they should be worrying about is the technological issues and concerns. So I think keep advocating for what you need, and then also take the time to take care of yourself, because right now you're dealing with multiple crises in our country and with your clients. So take care of you and get your rest and get what you need to refill yourself.
Fantastic, man. That was an incredible answer. I wanted to ask you also, specific to social work, just in the field, you having such a depth of experience in the social work field, what are a couple of things that you feel like are unique about your specific discipline?
I love this question. So what's unique about social work, I think, is how we're trained. And a lot of people don't realize this. Social workers have broad training. So we are trained to intervene at multiple levels. The societal level, so looking at big problems like systemic and structural oppressions and policies and things that affect the larger community. And we're also trained to work at what we refer to as the meso level. So looking at like communities, organizations, and how those run, and then also at the in-person individual level and systems level. So we're very broadly trained, and we can flow in between all those systems, and we include all of that work in all of our work. And I'm a macro social worker. I work on those big areas, but I use those clinical skills as I do this type of work. And our clinical social workers use their macro skills when they do their type of work. And the other thing is that I do like to say is that we also are a profession that evolves. So because we are charged with that societal level change and working toward that change, we also have to evolve as a society, as a profession, as society evolves. So I'm just going to give you a quick example. Like when I was in school, we were talking about LGBTQ issues, but it was primarily sexual orientation and making sure that there was equality and equal opportunity and policy change based on sexual orientation. In the last few years, I've seen that I've seen us as a profession move more into the realm of gender identity and making sure that we have these trainings and these policy changes to protect people who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. So we evolved. These are things that probably were never even talked about, like in the 1950s and 60s, when our social workers were being educated, that now we're evolving and we're making sure we're at the forefront of those issues.
Awesome. We wanted to ask you a couple of questions about leadership in general. It is a huge benefit to our audience to have access to somebody who's leading on the level like that you are, honestly. We already spoke. We are doing a series highlighting female leaders in the industry this year, so we're building that out right now. I was wondering, what are some challenges that you feel like you've experienced that have been unique to you as a female leader in the industry?
I was thinking about this question and thinking about it because I was really thinking about my history of work as a woman. So when I started working as a teenager in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I had experience where I had supervisors who would touch my body, and that was okay. Like there were no repercussions for that. So like the sexism was just really unbelievable now that I look at it from this position, the things that I had to endure. And I know the people who've gone before me had to endure even worse than that. And people now are having to endure worse than that. So in thinking about this question, I was thinking about my own, how I progressed as a woman professionally. I've had a couple of really unique experiences that I think have helped me as I've gone into leadership roles. One of them was I worked at a Muslim school, and it was such a unique experience because it was the first time in my professional life that I was treated as an equal on every level. And I was truly valued for what I brought to the table professionally. Like I truly felt valued as an employee. And that's important to talk about because it really showed me, it kind of showed this light of times when I wasn't valued, or that maybe being a female came into play, because it did not come into play when I was at the Muslim school, because I was treated so differently than I'd ever been treated in a professional setting. So I was thinking about how that has really influenced my work in leadership positions. So when I've been in leadership positions, I can see when that sexism is creeping in. And a lot of times what it will look like is sometimes people will talk over me, or they'll interrupt me, or they'll discredit my area of expertise and like really question like how I could be an expert in something that I've been studying, for years, or that's really the way it looks. And then of course there's always like pay equity and all of this. So those are challenges that as women we face. And one thing that I've done since I've been in leadership positions is I always try to work with young female professionals. So, and really teaching them their value, and especially when they're going into the workforce and they're negotiating. So I have lots of conversations about their area of expertise and like, look, you have gone to school for, you've trained in, you are an expert in this area. And when you go to interview and you're negotiating pay, you need to negotiate for higher pay based on A, B, and C. And like really working with them to be able to ask for what they're worth, to be able to go in very strongly with their strengths. So I think I probably over answered your question, but those are the areas that I'm thinking about as being a female in a leadership position.
No, that was exactly the answer we were looking for. That was fantastic. Lastly, we are all going through a whole lot of changes and a lot of stress. One of the things that has come up repeatedly on all platforms has been self-care. And I think people are very interested to learn how other leaders in the industry are caring for themselves, like through all of this hardship. So what are one or two different ways that you are keeping yourself, your family, your staff, maybe even your members healthy?
That's a good question. It's so important for everyone. So for me, there's a couple of things I do in my wellness routine. One is exercise. I love to exercise. I worked as a personal trainer for years. So that changed a little bit with COVID because our gyms closed. So I had to create that pattern of when I exercise and how I do it and all of that. So that helped getting that straight. The other thing that's really important in my own wellness plan is my time and how I spend my time. I've not been the best at this. I've actually worked more since COVID started, not less. So I've made sure what I've tried to do is make the weekends my family time and not check email and not engage unless I have to, unless it's something comes up and it requires immediate attention. That belongs to my family. So I've done little things like on my iPhone, I've made it where it doesn't show me how many emails I have because it increases my anxiety and then I can't enjoy my time. For our staff, the staff at NASW New York State is unbelievable. I am so lucky to work with the team that I have. They are amazing people. The biggest thing is what we've been working on as a team is taking time off, because they will work. I will get emails from 11 o'clock at night and I'll have to email them the next morning and say, stop emailing at 11 o'clock at night. Like, you've got to stop working. You've got to take your vacation days. You have to take care of yourself. Don't think about work, not reaching out when people are on vacation time. So it's really, we're trying to get healthy as an organization so that we can kind of mirror that to our members and other people, that we have to take care of ourselves. And this is really stressful time. So it's more important than ever to do that.
Absolutely. This fantastic to hear that you are working so hard as a staff to land some of those things, because it's so easy to send emails at 11:30. So I wanted to transition into some of your social justice work, where you've done a ton of really fascinating research. I was wondering, inside the research that you've done, wanted to hit on some of the high points. But first, if you just give us an overview of some of the research that you've done.
Okay, so my dissertation research was on social activism. And what I really wanted to know was, I wanted to look at lifelong social activists, and I wanted to know why they were activists, like what made them different from people who weren't activists, and how they accomplished social change. So I conducted a qualitative research and I interviewed activists who had been active for 40 to 72 years. So these were all older adults who were still active at the time. That it looked a little different because they ranged in age from like 70 to 96. So their activism looked a little different in their older age, but they had been active since like the 1940s, 1950s. I wanted to do this because I have a multiracial family. And the most important thing in my life is that we have change as a society. So I wanted to see how people who've actually made change, how did they do that? And like learn from their strategies and techniques. So this was a 5-year study. I did multiple interviews, and then I also collected data. So some of them were really good record keepers, and they had diaries from like the 1940s, 50s, 60s. There were newspaper articles. There was all this rich data and how and what they had done. So that's what I did. I collected all that, I analyzed that, and came up with a really long dissertation explaining how they accomplished those things and who they were as people and how that impacted why they got into social activism and how they engaged in activism.
Can you tell us one of the most illuminating things that you uncovered or discovered during your research?
Yes. You said one. It might be a few more than one. So one of the things I learned is that anyone can be an activist. So the activists in my study, they use their own positions to create change. So they created change within their communities, within organizations where they worked or volunteered. And then some of them created change on a larger level. One of my activists sat as a student with other students with President Eisenhower asking him to send troops into Little Rock for the school desegregation. That was one of his first activism steps, was to sit with a sitting president. So like he did that from a position of a student. So that's, I learned, like they used their own areas of expertise. I had 3 who were preachers. I had one, she was a city worker, but she was the first female leader of the NAACP in her community, and she led them through the civil rights movement. She was phenomenal. Like, so each person, that's what I learned. Anyone can engage in social activism at any educational level, wherever you're at. It's just a dedication to change. Another interesting thing that I learned is that they would have a goal in mind. Like, so when they were working on racial equity, obviously they had certain goals in mind, like passing policy or legislation or practical change within organizations and how that looked. So they would have that goal, but how they met that goal came through collaboration. They always worked with other people, and they would always work with people from different perspectives, because they really couldn't create change without engaging people who didn't think the way they thought and didn't want the same goal as they did. So it was always about how you create these relationships and build bridges across communities to create the change, and listening to perspectives. So it wasn't like they weren't dogma, like this is the only way, this is how we have to do it. It was more like set the goal, work with groups of people and coalitions to meet that goal, and then being flexible that the way they think it may happen may not be the way it actually happens. But the most important thing is reaching the goal and doing that with groups of other people. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that it's also different personality types. So some of them were, I mean, they were leaders. like the woman I was talking about, she was a leader. She was strong. Everyone knew who she was. She died, I think it was 3 years ago that she died. When I went to her funeral, there were politicians there, like honoring her life. Like, she was a strong leader. And then I had some activists who were much more quiet in their demeanor. And sometimes they would take more of a support stance in the actions rather than the leading stance. They would offer the support behind people, but they all created change. So like all types of personalities, no matter where you are, no matter where you work, you can be a change agent and create change in your own environment.
That is so incredibly important for us all to understand. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to ask you too, you had mentioned that you are a part of a multi-ethnic family, and you talked a little bit before the interview about some of the ways that that's enriched your family's experience. That was just something that I felt like was good for us to talk about. So if you could share a few ways that's enriched your life.
Oh, absolutely. First, I would recommend that everybody be part of a multi-racial, multi-ethnic community. Whether you choose that to be your family or not, that's up to you. But for us, we chose that to be our family. My husband and I made a decision that we were going to build our family through adoption, and that we wanted to have a very diverse family. I'm actually Cherokee and identify as Native, but I have full white privilege. It's important to tell you that. My husband is white. So we have, our oldest son is 20 and he's Black. Our middle son is 19 and he is Cheyenne Arapaho, Jamaican, and Mexican. And my daughter is biracial. She is Black and white. So that's the demographics of our family. And I would say the reason why I say it's important to be part of a multiracial, multi-ethnic community is you learn so much. It's just, it enriches your life in so many ways. So the experiences, you can't talk about this without talking about race, because the experiences of my dark Black and brown son are so different than my life experiences, my husband's life experiences. The way that they engage in the world and the way the world engages with them is so different, and it builds empathy, and it builds a capacity, I think, within you. And I personally have never experienced racism, ever. No one has ever treated me differently because of the way that I look, but I see it every day within my kids. And it starts when they're young. And as you know, as a parent too, like, the rules are different for Black and brown kids. So even as little kids, I can remember them being 1, 2 years old in the store. And I would have to tell them, you look at that with your eyes, not your hands. Like, you don't get that same privilege of being able to take the toys off the shelf and carry them around and run around and act this way. Like, so literally from the time they're little, having that consciousness of how they engage with the world. And then as they grow, it's even more important. Every Black parent knows the talk you have with your kids. I don't have to explain that to any Black parent. You start very early with the conversations you have with them on how to keep themselves safe in society. And also having the same conversation that that's not fair. It's not right that I have to talk to you about this. It's a grievance within our soul that we have to have this conversation. But I want you alive. And to keep you alive, these are things you need to know. Like, here's how you interact with certain people. And I think for me, because my kids have parents with white privilege, there are things we cannot give them. We have always lived in Black and brown communities. We move based on census data. I look at the makeup of the community before we move. So we want a predominantly Black and brown area before we move, so that they are immersed within the culture. And so part of our experience is that there's certain things I'm not the right person and my husband's not the right person for. So when my kids experience particularly bad racist events to another level, a really bad event, I can't heal that soul wound. But we have this fantastic network in our community and our chosen family that can. So there's times we pull in our Black and brown, women and men in our community for our children, because they can heal things that we can't heal. So it's really being embedded within the community. And we live as a tribal community anyway. So this, Auntie Dawn, she's your boss. Like, she's going to tell you what to do and make sure you're doing right, and the teachers at school, the Black and brown teachers, they're your boss. They're going to make sure you're doing what you need to do at school. So it's a completely different way of thinking and raising and making sure they get what they need. And I will say my best moment as a parent was when all 3 of my kids not only claim their identity, but they have so much pride in their identity of who they are. And they wouldn't want to be any other identity. Like, they're in no part of them would they want to be any other race than what they are. And having the pride that goes with that. That was when I'm like, okay, I did a good job when I hit that point.
Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much for sharing that. Your family has such a unique story, and that you guys put so much work into those cultural issues and those identity issues over time. Like, in the long haul, it's fascinating to hear about. And you're also a brilliant storyteller. So thank you so much. I wanted to transition to some kind of client trauma related questions. So many of the clinicians that we work with, and I know your membership, are really, really struggling, not just with COVID, but with the current social unrest, the protests, everything else that's going on in our culture. They're dealing specifically with their clients, all the trauma issues. So clients of color that have been traumatized, dominant culture clients who have been traumatized in different ways, but still trauma. I just wanted to get your insight in terms of how clinicians can best equip themselves better to be able to deal with kind of some of the unique and specific traumas we're dealing with at this time.
I think this is a good question. I definitely want to start by saying I am not a trauma expert. And I always refer people to trauma experts when they think about dealing with that. But what I can speak to is that racial trauma is different than other trauma. Like, so, and there needs to be an understanding of that the trauma that when you talk about things like abuse, you know, sexual abuse, violence, that results in trauma for people. And that's a universal experience across race, across different membership groups. So that's one type of trauma that you have to address. Racial trauma is trauma that comes just because of what you look like. I mean, to get it to very simple terms, that Black and brown people have experiences that are so different than white people. So that's why I always make sure I say, even though I identify as Native, I have full white privilege, because nothing that I've ever experienced has been because I'm Native, because I look brown. My son, who's also Native, his experiences are way different than mine because he is dark. He's very dark. So that there's a difference between maybe me experiencing a trauma because of an event that happens in my life and the fact that, you know, my children and other Black and brown people have been, you know, that they get called the N-word, that, you know, things that have happened with law enforcement, things that have happened with people in authority, the fact that, you know, people may follow them in stores. I've never been followed in a store. I've never been questioned when I hand someone my credit card to make a purchase, but I know several of my friends have been, and they're all Black and brown. Like, you know, I don't have to make sure I have a receipt when I leave a store, but my kids do. They have to make sure they have their receipt so they don't get accused of stealing, you know, like, so that type of trauma is different because it's constant. It starts very young and very early, and there's a lot of work of externalizing that trauma and making it, you know, different from you. So I think it's really important clinicians understand that those are two different types of trauma, and then also recognize the resilience, because I think anytime you talk about trauma, you have to talk about resilience. So like, that's one thing I know I always bring in. I talk about my family a lot because I'm not a clinician. So I'm not working with clients, but I do work in my family every day. And one of the things that I always talk to them, we process trauma all the time, we process racism all the time. And one of the things that we do within that process, we always externalize it. Whatever's happened, we externalize it, talk about how it really doesn't have anything to do with them, that it's not because of who they are as a person or their character or anything, that it's racism, and we identify it as racism. And then we also talk about the resilience of the people. Look at the resilience of your people. Look at your own resilience. Look at what you've had to overcome, and look at what you face. And you get up every day and you still do what you need to do, and you still walk out of the house, and you walk within this every day, but you still do it. So like, I think that that's important, is to always talk about the resilience when we talk about the trauma.
Yeah, I want everybody to be aware that you are still very deeply involved in this work. How can our audience find out more about the work that you're currently doing?
Oh, this is good. So this is what we're doing through NASW, New York State. We created, so when George Floyd happened, I've been doing this work for years, and I think other people that I've talked with who've been doing this work for years, the first thought we had was, why is this happening now? And why hasn't it happened with other people and other deaths and other atrocities? I had to move past that, and I did. Like, I had to move past that. It doesn't matter why it's happening, it is. And we're at a place of racial reckoning. We've been here before. We've been here, you know, in the 60s, but we have to take advantage of this and what's going on now and really doing something about it. So right now, my work is through the chapter. And so we immediately put together a plan to embed within our chapter. So we have an anti-racism plan, and we're addressing this in multiple areas. So one way, and a lot of this came through my research, because I researched how do you create social change, and then I learned, and now I'm applying it. So one thing I learned through my research was education. You have to educate people on whatever's happening. So we're doing this through our continuing education series. So we're having an anti-racism series. These trainings are free for all our members, and we're going to make at least 3 of them free for everybody so that they have access to the content. So it'll be a continuing education training at least once a month that focuses on racism. So that's the education component. The second component is really focused on self-reflection and training on how to have difficult conversations. Because some people have never engaged in race conversations, and it can be extremely uncomfortable for people to start those conversations. So we want to provide a space where people can do that. This is a lot of the work I did when I was at SUNY Albany with my partner, Dawn Knight Thomas. So this was roughly modeled off of the work that we did. So we do groups. We have it co-facilitated by someone who has white privilege and someone who is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or person of color. Those are the facilitators. We have guided questions, and we have very honest conversations about race. So we had our first session on this in June. Our first question was, when did you first experience racism or learn about racism? This is very powerful in mixed groups because the answers are very different from BIPOC population and white population. And it's such a great opportunity for the people to be able to talk together and heal and be able to self-reflect in ways that they've contributed to racism and ways that they cannot contribute to racism. And it also models how to have these discussions that even though they're difficult, you can have them in respectful ways. So that we're going to continue this series. I'm actually meeting with the person spearheading that today, so we can talk about when we'll schedule the next one. Then we're doing a action series. So this is really looking at how do we create policy change. We have a phenomenal policy coordinator, Evelyn Williams. I can't say enough about Evelyn. Evelyn's been in this work for over 40 years. She knows what she's doing, and she's done 2 of these. We're calling them work groups. She felt it was extremely important to start with the history of racism in the country before we get to the work. So the first two work groups have been really talking about the history of racism, giving resources to people to read so that they understand how racism is woven throughout society through policies and through practice. And she's going to continue this, and eventually what we're going to get to is work groups of people who are looking at either existing policies or if we need new policies on how to change not only state policies, but also organizational policies. So like if we're looking at education, really looking at how can we get more teeth in board versus Brown versus the Board of Education to get equality in our schools, looking at how schools are financed, doing all this research, looking at the, schools that are primarily Black and Brown, that we know they don't have the same resources as white schools. All of those different things, putting together our research and how can we make policy change. So that's one initiative. We're going to have an open mic, and this is going to be a creative expression series. These are incredibly powerful if you've ever been. So really looking at spoken word, poetry, song, just creative expression around race. And we're going to be scheduling our first one at the end of August and invite everyone to participate. These can be healing and educational, but also an outlet to get that creativity out and to express oneself. We have, the other thing we knew we needed were resources. So we created a web page. So people can go to our website, which you can send them the link to. And the first banner on there is our Black Lives Matter. You click in there and it shows you all our initiatives and what we're doing within each one. And then there's also a resources tab where we're collecting videos, articles on different areas of race. So like maybe race and children, race and healing, race and police, like just different things so that there's just resources. And our last initiative, which just came up in the last couple of weeks that we're starting on Tuesday, is as social workers, you know, really looking at what can we change and what do we have control over. Well, the one thing we can change is our profession. So we have to acknowledge the racism, the historical racism in social work, and the current racism in social work, and how can we change our profession to make it equitable. So that's going to start on Tuesday. We're going to have a town hall. The first one's going to be acknowledging racism and talking about current racism. The next one is when the work starts. And we're going to start with identifying goals of what would our profession look like if it was equitable. So one thing that immediately comes to my mind is pay equity. Black and brown social workers being paid the same as white social workers. And there's going to be all sorts of goals that we're going to have. We're going to develop those goals as a community. And then we're going to have work groups that will be led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color social workers. And those work groups will create information that we can disseminate. So action steps to meet the goals to create an equitable profession. So that it's going to be long work, it's going to be hard work, but we can do it. And that's what we can change as social workers, is we can change our own profession and make it equitable. So that's what we're doing right now in our race work.
That is absolutely fascinating. This has been such an engaging conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for joining us today. And we are looking forward to the work you continue to do and to doing more with you. You have a fantastic day.
Thank you.